"They took everything from me," I said, looking at the empty account. "You're exaggerating," she replied coldly. That night I changed all the passwords, packed my things, and left. When the police came for them, I didn't cry, only watched as their world collapsed while they screamed for mercy. Welcome. I invite you to listen to this story and rate it on a 10-point scale. Please leave your comments. This is very important. When I first learned that my savings were gone, the realization didn't hit all at once. It came in sharp, disbelieving fragments, bank statements that didn't add up, withdrawals I hadn't made, and finally, the crushing truth that it was my own mother and sister who had taken everything. The betrayal felt unreal, like some distorted nightmare I couldn't wake from. Martin, my attorney, listened patiently as I laid out the entire story. We spent hours discussing what could be done. If the police investigation confirmed the evidence, the district attorney would pursue criminal charges. At the same time, I had the right to file a civil suit to recover the stolen funds and possibly claim additional damages. Martin agreed to represent me in the civil matter and to coordinate with the criminal prosecutors. His calm professionalism helped anchor me when my emotions threatened to spill over. "What about Amanda?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. "She may not have physically stolen the money, but she definitely knew and benefited." He nodded slowly, thinking. "If she knowingly received stolen funds, she could be charged as an accessory after the fact, or with receiving stolen property. At the very least, she'll likely be named in the civil case to recover whatever portion went to her." Leaving Martin's office, I felt a strange combination of relief and exhaustion. The shock had settled into a cold clarity. I couldn't go back to my apartment. Not yet. Every corner of it carried reminders of what had been taken, not just in money but in trust. So I checked into a small hotel instead, a neutral space where I could breathe and think without the ghosts of betrayal pressing in from every direction. That night, I ordered room service, not because I was hungry, but because I knew I needed to eat. As I picked at a sandwich, I made a list of everything I had to secure: phone number, bank accounts, passwords. I called the credit bureaus to freeze my credit reports and changed every login I had, creating new passwords so complex that no one in my family could possibly guess them. I called my boss next, explaining that I needed a few personal days to deal with a family emergency. He was kind and understanding, reminding me that I had rarely taken time off. His compassion nearly broke me. Later that evening, as I sat in the quiet of my hotel room, the first waves of calm began to settle over me. The fear hadn't vanished, but something else had begun to take root beneath it, a sense of resolve. For the first time since this nightmare began, I knew exactly what I needed to do. After leaving Martin's office, I checked into a modest hotel not far from the city center. I didn't want to go back home, not yet. The thought of being surrounded by the same walls that had heard the arguments, the half-truths, the lies, made my skin crawl. The hotel room was small but clean, with pale curtains that let in the afternoon light and a faint smell of disinfectant. For the first time in days, I locked a door behind me and felt, however briefly, that I was safe. I placed my bag on the bed, sat beside it, and stared at the wall for what must have been several minutes. My hands were trembling, though I didn't feel cold. It was as if my body hadn't yet realized that the danger had already passed. I breathed slowly until the shaking subsided. Then I took out my laptop, opened my banking app, and began the process of protecting what little remained of my finances. The first step was obvious. I changed every password I had. Email, bank accounts, online storage, social media, everything. I replaced each one with random strings of letters and numbers, impossible for anyone else to guess. I wrote them down on a single sheet of paper, folded it twice, and slipped it into my wallet. As I did, I felt a strange kind of power return, small but solid. Next came the phone calls, to the credit bureaus, to my bank, to the utility companies. I explained that my accounts had been compromised and requested temporary freezes. The clerks were polite, sometimes even sympathetic, though none of them could see the full weight of what had happened. To them, it was just another report of identity theft. To me, it was the unraveling of my entire family. By early evening, exhaustion hit. I hadn't realized how tense I'd been until I finally stopped moving. I ordered room service, soup, and a sandwich, but when it arrived, I barely touched it. My appetite was gone. The only thing that mattered now was control, rebuilding the small pieces of order that had been ripped away. Before bed, I opened my email again and began drafting a message to my boss. My hands hovered over the keyboard before I started typing. I need a few days off to handle a personal emergency. I hesitated, deleting and rewriting the same line 3 times, trying to make it sound less fragile. In the end, I hit send, closed the laptop, and sat in silence. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound in the room. My reflection in the dark window looked distant, like someone I didn't fully recognize. The anger had dulled into something quieter, not forgiveness, but a kind of numb understanding. I had spent my whole life believing that trust was unconditional, that family couldn't cross certain lines. Now I knew better. Lying in bed, I kept replaying moments from the last few days. The bank teller's sympathetic expression, Martin's steady voice as he outlined the next steps, Mom's evasive tone when I confronted her, the way she avoided my eyes, Amanda's silence, the way she refused to take any responsibility, as if pretending ignorance could make it less real. Every memory carried a sting, but also a lesson. I realized that control wasn't something others gave, it was something I had to claim. So I made a list of what needed to be done next. Cancel joint accounts, remove shared authorizations, contact the detective handling the case, and check if Martin had received the updated statements. I folded the paper neatly and left it on the nightstand beside the lamp. When I finally turned off the light, the darkness felt unfamiliar. I had spent nights before in that same silence, but this was different, sharper, heavier. It was the sound of knowing that nothing in my life would ever go back to the way it was. The next morning, I woke early. My body was sore, as if I'd been carrying invisible weights. I showered, dressed simply, and drank the bitter coffee the hotel provided. It tasted terrible, but it grounded me in a strange way. Small rituals like that, coffee, clean clothes, organized lists, became proof that I was still functioning, still moving forward. After breakfast, I called Martin to confirm the next appointment. He answered on the second ring, his tone steady and reassuring. "I've filed the preliminary report," he said. "The investigators will contact you directly within a few days. Try to keep copies of all your records in one place. We'll need them soon." "I will," I replied. "Thank you." There was a pause, not awkward but heavy. He didn't offer false comfort or easy promises. Instead, he just said, "Take care of yourself. This kind of betrayal cuts deep." His words lingered long after the call ended. Later, as I sat by the window, watching the traffic move below, I realized how surreal everything still felt. People on the street were going about their day, laughing, talking, carrying groceries, completely unaware of the quiet storms that others might be enduring behind closed doors. I wondered how many of them had faced something like this, the collapse of trust from those closest to them. By the time evening came again, I had rechecked all my accounts, printed new copies of my financial statements, and arranged them in a folder. There was comfort in organization, in turning chaos into something I could touch and control. For the first time since discovering the theft, I allowed myself to take a full breath. It wasn't relief, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that felt close. Stability, maybe, or strength. I had spent 2 days avoiding their calls. The silence between us wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. I needed space to think, to let the fog of disbelief settle before I faced them. But eventually, the phone lit up again with Mom's number, and this time I didn't ignore it. I answered. "Why haven't you called?" she demanded before I could even say hello. Her voice carried that sharp, familiar tone, offended, not remorseful. "I've been busy," I said calmly, keeping my voice even. "There are things I need to fix after what you did." Her response came fast, defensive, almost rehearsed. "Don't start with your accusations. You don't know the full story. You're making this bigger than it is." "There's nothing to exaggerate," I replied. "You took my savings without permission. That's theft, Mom." Silence stretched on the line for a moment. Then her voice softened, pretending concern. "You're overreacting, sweetheart. Families help each other. I just borrowed it, that's all. You would have done the same if you were in my place." "I wouldn't have," I said flatly. "And you didn't borrow it, you emptied the account. You didn't even tell me." Her tone shifted again, colder. "You've changed. You've become so ungrateful after everything I've done for you. You think you're better than us now because you have a job and a lawyer." The accusation rolled off me this time. I'd expected it. "This isn't about being better," I said. "It's about boundaries, and what you did was wrong." Her sigh came through the phone like static, sharp, dismissive. "You always twist things to make me the villain." "I'm not twisting anything," I said quietly. "The bank statements speak for themselves." When the call ended, I didn't cry. I just sat there, staring at the dark screen, realizing that she truly believed her own version. There was no apology, no hint of remorse, only justification. Not long after, Amanda called. I hesitated before answering, hoping maybe she'd sound different. She didn't. "I can't believe you're doing this," she started, her voice shaking, not from guilt but anger. "You're actually going to drag Mom through court. Do you have any idea what that'll do to her?" "I'm not doing anything to her," I said. "She did this to herself. I'm just holding her accountable." "Oh, please," she snapped. "You're just punishing her because you're bitter. She was desperate. You could have helped her, but instead you called a lawyer. What kind of daughter does that?" "I already helped for years," I said, trying to stay calm. "Paid bills, lent money, fixed things she broke. This wasn't help, this was deception." Amanda laughed, the sound sharp and mean. "You always think you're the victim. You've never understood Mom, never been there the way I have." "I understand her better than you think," I said. "And I know when something crosses the line." "She didn't mean to hurt you," Amanda insisted. "You're blowing this out of proportion. If you just talked to her properly, she'd make it right." I closed my eyes, listening to the absurdity of it. "Amanda," I said slowly, "she's not trying to make it right. She's pretending it didn't happen. That's not the same thing." There was silence on her end, and for a moment, I thought maybe she understood. But then came the words that sealed everything. "She's our mother. You can't treat her like a criminal." My throat tightened, but I forced my voice to stay steady. "She is a criminal, Amanda. What she did was illegal." Her response was a low, angry whisper. "You've always been dramatic. Maybe you deserve to lose a little. Maybe it'll teach you humility." And then she hung up. I sat there for a long time, the phone still in my hand, the sound of the disconnect echoing in my head. The room was quiet except for the low hum of the heater. I didn't move. I didn't cry. The hurt was too deep for tears. It had turned into something else entirely. That was the moment the last illusion shattered. I realized there would be no understanding, no reconciliation, not even acknowledgement. They weren't sorry. They didn't even see what they'd done as wrong. For years, I'd made excuses for them, told myself they were struggling, misunderstood, doing their best. But now, the truth stood bare. The bond I'd been trying so hard to preserve was already gone. It had been gone for a long time. I just refused to see it. I set the phone down, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle over me. The pain was still there, but underneath it was something new, a cold, steady clarity. I couldn't save people who didn't want to change. I couldn't make them see what they refused to admit. That night, I wrote everything down. Not out of anger, but to keep my thoughts clear, to remember exactly how this conversation unfolded when the case moved forward. Each word felt final, like closing a door. I read over what I'd written before turning off the light. There was no satisfaction, only certainty. I wasn't the same person who had begged for understanding. I had stopped hopping for remorse. That was the real break, not in the relationship, but in me. That night, after the phone calls, the silence in my room felt heavier than ever. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint reflection of myself in the dark window. Everything inside me was trembling, but my hands were steady. For the first time, there was no confusion, only a cold, deliberate understanding of what needed to be done. I opened my laptop and found the lawyer's number again. My fingers hovered over the keys for a few seconds before I finally typed. "I'm ready to move forward." The message looked small and simple on the screen, but it marked the end of hesitation. I pressed send, exhaled slowly, and felt a strange calmness settle in. There was no turning back now. I didn't want to go home after that. The apartment still felt like it belonged to someone else, to the version of me that trusted too easily. Even with the door locked, I didn't feel safe. The thought that someone I loved could walk in and take something again, it made the walls close in. So I made a decision. I'd protect what was left of my space and of myself. The next morning, I called a technician to install security cameras. It felt surreal at first, hearing my own voice explain that I needed surveillance in my own home. The man didn't ask questions, just nodded and started working. I watched as he placed small, almost invisible devices in the corners of the rooms. The quiet clicking of his tools filled the air, rhythmic and reassuring. When he left, I stood in the doorway, looking at the tiny lenses glinting faintly under the ceiling lights. It wasn't about paranoia. It was about control. For the first time in a long while, I was setting boundaries that couldn't be crossed unnoticed. That realization brought an odd sense of relief. Still, the vulnerability lingered. Every sound outside the apartment seemed sharper, every creak in the hallway louder than before. I caught myself double-checking the locks, glancing at the screen that showed live footage from the cameras. It was strange, feeling both exposed and empowered at once. Later that day, I met with Martin again. He greeted me with the same calm professionalism as always, but this time, I felt like an equal rather than a client desperate for guidance. "Are you certain?" he asked gently after I told him I wanted to proceed with both the criminal report and the civil claim. "I am," I said. "I've given them enough chances. There's nothing left to talk about." He nodded. "Then we'll do it properly. I'll prepare the paperwork. Once it's filed, we'll let the authorities handle the rest." I listened carefully as he outlined each step, the statements, the documents, the potential hearings. His words were practical, methodical, grounding. They replaced the chaos in my head with structure. By the time I left his office, I felt lighter. On my way back, the city looked different. The same streets I had walked 1,000 times before now carried a quiet clarity. I wasn't running from what happened anymore. I was moving through it, one deliberate step at a time. When I reached the apartment, I stopped at the door and hesitated. For a moment, I thought about everything I was losing: family, comfort, the illusion of safety that once existed. But then I remembered the empty bank account, the manipulation, the lies told so easily. Love without respect was just control in disguise. I unlocked the door and walked inside. The faint hum of the camera system greeted me, a reminder that I wasn't powerless anymore. I sat down, opened my laptop again, and began organizing the evidence: the screenshots, bank records, and emails. Each file I labeled felt like a small act of reclamation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. That night, as I reviewed the documents one last time, a quiet determination settled over me. There were no tears, no lingering doubts. The fear that had once dictated every choice had burned away, replaced by something stronger: resolve. I thought of how my mother's voice had sounded on the phone, full of self-pity and anger. I thought of Amanda's words, accusing me of cruelty. For years, I'd accepted their version of reality, where love meant obedience and guilt. But now I understood. I had the right to protect myself, even from them. I saved the last file and closed the laptop. The city outside was calm, lights flickering across the buildings. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice whispered that this was only the beginning. But for once, that didn't scare me. Before going to bed, I checked the locks again, then glanced at the monitor. The cameras showed empty rooms bathed in soft light. My home looked different now, stripped of warmth perhaps, but honest. Safe. As I lay down, I felt exhaustion wash over me. But beneath it was something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The kind that comes not from forgiveness, but from finally choosing yourself. I realized that the cameras weren't just for protection. They were symbols of something greater, a promise to never let anyone cross my boundaries again. And with that thought, I closed my eyes. For the first time since everything began, I slept without fear. The following morning felt charged with tension even before I left the small, sterile apartment I had rented. After weeks of carefully setting boundaries, consulting Martin, and providing the police with every piece of information they needed, the moment had finally arrived. The investigation had progressed steadily. Detectives had reviewed ATM surveillance footage, cross-checked banking records, and interviewed employees from multiple financial institutions. Every withdrawal, every transfer, every suspicious transaction had been documented and verified. My role had been to cooperate fully while maintaining as much emotional distance as I could muster. But I knew today would demand more than distant observation. I had made the choice to witness the arrests from a safe distance. I wanted to see the process unfold, to confirm with my own eyes that the law would hold them accountable. It was a strange mix of fear, anticipation, and determination that made my stomach churn as I parked my rental car a block away from my mother's house. The early morning light barely touched the street, leaving the neighborhood in a muted haze. Only a few neighbors were stirring, gathering newspapers or preparing for their commutes. I kept the windows up, heart pounding as I adjusted the seat to give myself a clear view of the house's front entrance. At exactly 7:32 a.m., unmarked police cars rolled silently onto the street, accompanied by a single marked patrol vehicle. The officers moved with precision, their expressions serious but calm. 4 approached the front door, while others remained by the vehicles, maintaining a secure perimeter. The detective who had guided me through the process knocked firmly on the door, the sound resonating across the quiet morning. Moments later, the porch light flicked on, and my mother appeared, still in her bathrobe, her face registering confusion at first, then shock, and finally shifting into anger as she realized what was happening. She tried to pull the door closed, but an officer's foot prevented it from shutting, and he spoke calmly, instructing her to step aside. Time seemed to stretch as she hesitated, then finally moved back, allowing the officers to enter. I watched with my heart in my throat as the situation unfolded with surgical precision. 10 minutes later, the front door opened again, and both my mother and Amanda emerged, now in casual clothing, hands cuffed behind their backs. Amanda's face was streaked with tears, blotchy and swollen from hours of crying, her body trembling with visible panic. My mother's posture was rigid, head held high, scanning the street as though daring someone to intervene. Her eyes caught mine from across the street, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I saw the fury and disbelief burning there. She froze mid-step, her gaze locked onto me, and then shouted something I couldn't make out before being led firmly toward the waiting patrol car. The scene drew the attention of several neighbors, who had come out of their houses or peeked through blinds to witness the unfolding events. I knew that the public nature of the arrests would leave no room for vague explanations or fabrications. There was no hiding what had been done. No more subtle manipulations or attempts to rewrite history. Justice was being enacted, and I was seeing it firsthand. I stayed in the car, watching silently as the vehicles departed with both women inside. Emotionally, I expected to feel vindicated or satisfied, maybe even a rush of relief, but instead, there was an emptiness, a surreal sensation as if I were observing someone else's life playing out. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, heart still pounding, yet I felt a strange sense of liberation. The act of witnessing had been necessary for me, a personal acknowledgement that their actions would not go unchecked. After the cars disappeared from view, I drove to the coffee shop where Martin had arranged to meet me before proceeding to the police station. The booking process was methodical and extensive. My mother and Amanda were photographed, fingerprinted, and placed in holding cells while awaiting their initial court appearances. Martin provided continuous updates, explaining the procedures and potential outcomes with calm precision. Bail would likely be set, he explained, considering the charges and their lack of prior records. The anticipation of seeing their reactions and the certainty of the legal system at work left me emotionally drained but resolute. Later that day, we learned that bail had been set, $25,000 for my mother and $15,000 for Amanda. Initially, neither could post it, meaning they would remain in custody until arrangements were made. The detective asked whether anyone could intervene on their behalf, but I knew the answer. No one in their circle had the resources or inclination to interfere. Eventually, my mother reached a distant relative who agreed to post bail, ensuring their release by evening with court dates scheduled for the following month. Even as I returned to my temporary apartment that evening, I felt a strange mixture of emptiness and relief. The immediate danger had passed, yet the process of legal accountability had only just begun. The emotional toll was intense, but I had positioned myself firmly. The line had been drawn, boundaries enforced, and for the first time, I truly felt the power of standing up for myself. The next morning, after observing the arrests from a distance, I felt the weight of anticipation settle heavily over me. The procedural world of law moved with a precise, measured rhythm, but my emotions swirled unpredictably. I followed my lawyer, Martin, to the station, entering the interview room where the detectives periodically updated us on every procedural step. I listened attentively, noting every detail as they fingerprinted and photographed my mother and Amanda. Both of them, dressed plainly now in jeans and sweatshirts, appeared smaller and more vulnerable than the figures who had caused such turmoil in my life. Amanda's face was streaked with red from tears, while my mother maintained her stiff posture, scanning the room as if searching for some hidden ally, her eyes eventually landing on me. I did not flinch. I would watch, but I would not interact. The initial appearance before the judge confirmed what I already understood. The legal system could act, regardless of family ties. Bail was set. My mother at $25,000, Amanda at $15,000. Neither could arrange the funds immediately, leaving them in custody for a short period. The detective asked whether I knew anyone who could post bail, and I shook my head firmly. My mother had a sister living in New Hampshire, estranged for years, and Amanda's acquaintances were struggling themselves. There would be no easy way out for them. While waiting in the sterile, echoing halls of the station, I absorbed the gravity of the situation. The detectives spoke quietly, but with respect for my composure. One of them, leaning slightly closer, remarked, "Many victims of family financial crimes eventually fold under pressure or guilt. Your persistence allows us to act. Their acknowledgement hit me harder than I expected. All my life, I had carried responsibility quietly, sacrificing emotional and personal safety to maintain fragile family connections. To have a professional recognize my deliberate action was unexpectedly validating. Later, news reached us that my mother had finally contacted her sister, who agreed to post bail for both women. They would be released by evening, their court dates set for the following month. Though some relief flickered within me, I remained watchful, aware that the confrontation had only just begun. The legal battle was unfolding in parallel with an intense internal reckoning. The realization that these were not temporary misjudgments, but premeditated acts with long-reaching consequences. At home, I sifted through the procedural papers Martin provided, including arrest reports and early court filings. Each document was a reminder that the orderly machinery of justice was slowly encasing my chaotic reality, placing boundaries around the betrayal and defining the contours of accountability. I set up reminders and notes, planning every upcoming court appearance with meticulous care, each one a step toward reclaiming control. During the days that followed, my mother attempted to reach me through indirect channels, alternating between furious voicemails demanding I drop the charges and tearful messages citing family loyalty. Amanda appeared once at my workplace, provoking the lobby security to intervene. I responded only through Martin, maintaining a strict boundary, letting the law filter all communication. The procedural tempo contrasted sharply with my private emotional state. I had anticipated some relief, some vindication, but the mix of detachment and lingering grief was stronger than expected. Sitting with Martin, we discussed the upcoming hearings and possible outcomes. He explained the likelihood of bail, public defenders, private counsel, and the potential for plea agreements. Each scenario was dissected with clinical precision, but I noticed a subtle shift. His respect for my resolve had deepened. "You're handling this with remarkable composure," he noted quietly, reinforcing my sense of personal strength. Simultaneously, recovery efforts began on the financial side. My bank froze Amanda's newly opened accounts, reclaiming some portion of the stolen funds. Yet, despite these small victories, the reality remained stark. The majority of my money had been spent, used to pay off debts and acquire furniture and electronics for Amanda's new apartment. Each recovered item, each frozen account, was both a tangible reclamation and a reminder of the original violation. Through it all, I found myself living in an unsettling limbo, balancing between observation and anticipation. Hotel rooms and temporary apartments became my refuge. Security measures felt increasingly necessary rather than paranoid. I installed locks, alarm systems, and monitored every minor irregularity. The very act of preparing, of imposing structure, served as a psychological bulwark against the chaos inflicted by those I once trusted most. My mother's manipulative tactics, Amanda's flustered attempts at rationalization, and my own oscillation between empathy and righteous indignation created a persistent undercurrent of tension. Yet, each interaction confirmed a crucial truth. They were unwilling to accept responsibility fully. Only through formal channels, legal processes, surveillance, and controlled interaction could accountability be enforced. By observing, documenting, and remaining resolute, I experienced a subtle but profound shift in self-perception. The recognition from law enforcement, the methodical unfolding of criminal procedures, and the incremental recovery of stolen assets contributed to a growing sense of agency. The emotional terrain was fraught, yet within the confines of law and structure, I began reclaiming authority over my life and resources. Even as the procedural wheels turned, I allowed brief moments to reflect on the personal transformation unfolding within me. Composure and deliberate action replaced helplessness. Boundaries were no longer theoretical. They had become actionable, enforceable, and respected by external authorities. The contrast between the impersonal efficiency of justice and my private, personal recovery underscored the duality of my journey. The legal system offered resolution, but the internal reckoning demanded ongoing presence, attention, and assertion. The first few days concluded with formal documentation, court scheduling, and financial adjustments. Each step reinforced a hard-earned understanding. Accountability would be achieved not by hope or appeals to familial loyalty, but through steadfast observation, unwavering adherence to procedure, and the patient unfolding of legal processes. The mixture of relief, exhaustion, and a dawning sense of control characterized this period. I was no longer simply reacting. I was strategically participating in shaping the consequences for those who had violated the trust I once extended without question. In these early stages of the legal process, I felt the faint emergence of empowerment. The cold, methodical operation of law contrasted with my emotional struggle. Yet within that contrast, I began to discover a foundational truth. Vigilance, planning, and personal resolve could create a protective framework even amid profound familial betrayal. My strength, previously untested in such direct confrontation, was now proving itself, measured not in victory or restitution alone, but in the clarity of purpose and the reclaiming of boundaries that had once been dismissed. The news of the arrests rippled through my extended family like a sudden storm, breaking the quiet that usually cloaked our interactions. Almost immediately, reactions split into two clear camps. Some relatives expressed outrage on behalf of my mother and sister, condemning me for what they called overreacting, and questioning why I had chosen legal action against my own blood. They spoke of family loyalty as if it were a shield against accountability, implying that my decision was cruel, unfeeling, even unnecessary. Their voices carried disbelief, veiled judgments, and a kind of moral certainty that I had failed to anticipate. Meanwhile, another smaller group reached out with quiet support. These were the ones who had observed the patterns of manipulation over the years, who had witnessed subtle betrayals, and the emotional labor I had shouldered without recognition. Their words were gentle but firm, acknowledging the courage it took to insist on boundaries that had long been ignored. One cousin, who had known of my independent streak and the repeated ways my mother had exploited it, offered heartfelt encouragement, reminding me that self-respect was never wrong, even in the face of familial opposition. This contrast was jarring. The same family produced voices of condemnation and voices of understanding, each speaking from a vastly different perception of what constituted fairness, loyalty, and love. Amidst this swirl of voices, one call arrived that I had not expected. My father. I froze the moment his name appeared on the screen, a mixture of apprehension and cautious hope settling in my chest. It had been more than 15 years since we had spoken meaningfully, our connection fractured by time, distance, and unspoken regrets. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the answer button, but pressed it anyway, drawn by a need I could not fully articulate. "Bernie, it's your father," he said, his tone tentative yet unmistakably sincere. Hearing his voice was at once familiar and strange, a ghost of a past I had long compartmentalized. "I heard about what happened with your mother and the money," he continued, pausing briefly as if weighing his words carefully. I braced myself, expecting the familiar pattern of minimization or a plea for me to reconsider my actions. Instead, he surprised me. "I waited, expecting to try and convince you to drop the charges," he admitted, "but I just wanted to say I am sorry." His apology carried with it the weight of years and absence. "I know I wasn't there for you growing up, and maybe if I had been, things could have been different. What your mother did was wrong, and you have every right to press charges." The words pierced through layers of old resentment and caution. I felt tears threatening, a mixture of validation and relief washing over me. For the first time, an immediate family member recognized the harm without equivocation, without excusing the perpetrators. I managed to respond, my voice tight but steady. "Thank you for saying that. It means a lot." Our conversation was hesitant, awkward at times, yet beneath the stilted phrases was a genuine effort to bridge a gap I had assumed was permanent. He shared pieces of his life, remarriage, stepchildren, his work as a contractor in another state, and slowly, the conversation shifted from guilt and regret to cautious connection. We agreed to maintain contact, initially through small, manageable exchanges. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to imagine a possibility of family ties that could be supportive rather than burdensome. After the call, a small sense of warmth lingered, mingling with the residual fatigue of the past weeks. This was not an erasure of the pain or the betrayal, nor a restoration of old patterns. It was a tentative acknowledgement that some relationships could be redefined on healthier terms, given effort and boundaries. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings moved forward with relentless precision. My mother and sister continued to navigate the judicial system, each responding differently to the prospect of accountability. Updates came through Martin, who relayed developments with calm clarity, allowing me to remain informed without becoming entangled in the raw volatility of confrontation. Each piece of information reinforced my understanding that the separation I had enforced was necessary, and that the support of others, even extended family like my father, could offer a sense of grounding I had previously lacked. This period highlighted an essential truth. Family is not defined solely by proximity or shared history. It is shaped by the capacity to recognize wrongdoing, to respect boundaries, and to offer support without manipulation or expectation. The contrast between condemnation from some relatives and encouragement from others illuminated the spectrum of familial responses, and I found myself relying more on those who chose understanding over judgment. I spent the following days reflecting on these interactions, noting a subtle shift in my perspective on the concept of family. The calls of support, particularly my father's unexpected acknowledgement, became touchstones, reminders that genuine care and recognition could exist even within a fractured network. For the first time, I considered the possibility that connections could be rebuilt, cautiously, deliberately, with a focus on accountability and mutual respect. Amid the stress of court dates, restitution planning, and ongoing police inquiries, these moments of connection provided a counterbalance. They reminded me that while betrayal had shaped much of my past, the present held opportunities for healthier relationships, built on honesty and recognition rather than obligation or fear. The lesson crystallized gradually. It was possible to reclaim agency over my life while selectively allowing supportive ties to reemerge, fostering a network of chosen reliability rather than enforced duty. By the end of that week, I had begun drafting boundaries not only with my mother and sister, but also with relatives whose judgments threatened to destabilize my recovery. I documented expectations for interactions, noted patterns of concern or criticism, and highlighted individuals whose support was consistent and constructive. This exercise was both practical and symbolic, a tangible step in reclaiming control over my environment and a psychological affirmation that I had the right to prioritize my well-being. The call from my father remained etched in my mind as an example of what was possible when recognition and empathy replaced denial and defensiveness. It was a glimmer of warmth after a prolonged period of coldness, a reminder that family could include individuals who validated my experience rather than undermined it. In this emerging framework, I began to envision a future where relationships were consciously chosen, nurtured through respect, and bounded by clear principles, a stark contrast to the patterns that had led to betrayal and loss. This week, more than any other since the ordeal began, marked a subtle yet profound shift in my internal landscape. I understood that reconciliation was not a given. Forgiveness was optional, and trust had to be rebuilt incrementally. And yet, for the first time in many years, I felt the faint but undeniable possibility of connection, of familial warmth untainted by manipulation, beginning to emerge. The days leading up to the plea offers were a tense mix of anticipation and apprehension. Martin had kept me informed of every development, explaining how prosecutors generally handled cases like mine. Amanda's attorney reached out first, and it was clear she had decided to accept responsibility. She would plead guilty to receiving stolen property, return all recoverable assets, and follow a repayment plan for the remainder. Part of me had expected some resistance from her, but her acceptance felt like a small relief, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing that I had longed for. Mother, on the other hand, remained defiant. Her attorney communicated her unwillingness to admit guilt, insisting she had done nothing wrong. I listened quietly as Martin explained the implications, the stark contrast between Amanda's compliance and my mother's obstinacy, emphasizing the gap between their perceptions and reality. Amanda's choice reflected fear and accountability. My mother reflected a lifetime of justification and entitlement. I spent those hours between calls reflecting on the consequences that were about to unfold, mentally preparing myself for the courtroom. I felt a complex mixture of anger, exhaustion, and a strange sense of empowerment. For the first time in my life, I was asserting boundaries that were absolute, enforced by the law, not by fragile family negotiations or fleeting appeals to conscience. The reality of what had been taken from me, the betrayal, and the calculated steps of both women to exploit my trust weighed heavily on my mind. When the day came to submit the plea agreements, Amanda formally acknowledged her role. Her confession was thorough and unflinching. She admitted she had known the funds were stolen and had nonetheless used them to cover her mounting debts, furnish a new apartment, and secure financial stability for herself. Her tears were evident as she spoke through her attorney, but the confession was complete. I listened from the gallery, silent but attentive, feeling an unfamiliar combination of sorrow and resolution. Amanda's acknowledgement did not erase the damage, but it allowed a sliver of closure, a recognition that at least one person was willing to face the consequences. Mother, however, continued to resist. She postponed her decision until the last possible moment, clinging to rationalizations that had defined her entire approach to life. Her refusal was a stark reminder of the psychological patterns I had endured for decades: manipulation, denial, and the insistence that her perspective alone justified her actions. Watching her stall, I felt a familiar twinge of anger, yet I also noticed a shift within myself. I no longer felt compelled to coax understanding or forgiveness from her. My role was now clearly defined as a witness to accountability, not a negotiator of morality. Finally, on the last day to accept the plea deals, her attorney conveyed her acceptance. She would plead guilty to the reduced charges, theft and assault, in exchange for a sentence of 6 months in county jail, 3 years of probation, and full restitution of the unrecovered funds. The relief that came with the finality of her decision was tempered by years of accumulated pain and betrayal, yet it was undeniable. Justice was in motion. Martin guided me through the next steps, explaining that I would have the opportunity to submit a victim impact statement. This was my chance to articulate, directly to the court, the emotional and financial devastation I had endured. I spent the following days drafting and revising my statement meticulously, seeking words that would convey the depth of betrayal, the violation of trust, and the painstaking process of reclaiming my boundaries. I wrote about the years of diligent work that had been exploited, the emotional labor that had gone unrecognized, and the critical moment when I decided that protecting myself was paramount. The final version of my statement was a mirror of my internal transformation. I spoke of trust broken, respect denied, and the long journey to reassert control over my life. I described the balance between personal pain and the necessity of accountability, emphasizing that no amount of restitution could erase the emotional scars, yet it could serve as a formal acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The words felt heavy on the page, yet liberating as I read them aloud to myself, each sentence reinforcing my newfound autonomy. Standing in the courtroom to deliver the statement was an emotional culmination of the past months. I faced both women directly, noting the contrast between Amanda's subdued remorse and my mother's rigid composure. My voice remained steady, though the emotions behind it were palpable. I recounted the years of financial stewardship, the careful saving and planning, and the shock of betrayal that had upended my sense of security. I articulated the personal cost of their actions, not only in monetary terms, but in the erosion of trust, the questioning of my own judgment, and the realization that family loyalty was not unconditional. I concluded by emphasizing the importance of accountability and personal integrity, hoping that my words would resonate, not only with the court, but with the perpetrators themselves. For the first time, I felt the weight of my voice as a tool of validation, not just for the legal system, but for my own journey of self-assertion. As I returned to my seat, the expressions of those in the courtroom reflected the gravity of the statement, yet it was the internal shift within me that mattered most. I had transitioned from victimhood to agency, from passive endurance to active self-protection. The judge accepted the plea agreements, assigning the sentence and probation terms accordingly. My mother began her term in county jail immediately, while Amanda was placed on probation with mandatory financial counseling and community service. Both were responsible for restitution payments until the full amount was repaid. As the court adjourned, Amanda turned toward me briefly, silently mouthing an apology, her eyes filled with remorse. My mother remained stoic, her gaze forward, revealing nothing. The doors closed behind them, signaling the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, one in which I had reclaimed control, autonomy, and the clarity to prioritize my own well-being over familial obligation. The courtroom was quiet, the air heavy with tension as the judge prepared to announce the sentences. Every detail of the past months, the betrayal, the sleepless nights, the careful steps I had taken to protect myself, felt concentrated into this single moment. I could feel the weight of expectation and apprehension pressing against my chest. Both my mother and Amanda sat in front of me, flanked by their attorneys, their faces a mixture of defiance, fear, and resignation. The judge's voice cut through the room with deliberate clarity. My mother would serve 6 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation, and was required to make full restitution for the funds that remained unreturned. Amanda would receive 2 years of probation, mandatory financial counseling, and community service, along with responsibility for repaying any recoverable stolen assets. The sentences were exactly what the plea agreements had outlined. I felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. Relief, because justice, in its structured and deliberate way, had been served. Emptiness, because the personal cost of reaching this point was immense. My family had been irrevocably altered. The mother and sister I had known, who I had loved and trusted, had been exposed as perpetrators of deliberate harm, and the bonds I had taken for granted were broken beyond repair. As my mother was led from the courtroom, her posture rigid and unyielding, she did not glance at me. Amanda turned slightly, her eyes red and puffy, and mouthed a silent "I'm sorry." That tiny gesture, fragile and tentative, was the only acknowledgement of the damage she had caused. The doors closed behind them, and a tangible finality settled over the space. For the first time, I could breathe without feeling the imminent threat of betrayal looming over me. The reporters outside were already gathering, cameras trained on the courthouse steps, microphones poised to capture any statement. I chose to remain silent, letting my lawyer give a brief explanation about the importance of holding people accountable for financial crimes, even within a family. I did not need the public's attention. I needed the private act of reclaiming my life to solidify within myself. Driving away from the courthouse, I felt a strange sense of detachment. Months of emotional labor, strategic planning, and legal navigation had culminated here, yet the personal closure I sought felt only partially achieved. The structure of law had punished the wrongdoers, but the void they left in my personal life could not be filled by any sentence or restitution. I recognized that the sense of control and autonomy I had fought so hard to reclaim was more profound than any external judgment. Returning to my temporary apartment, I allowed myself a moment to exhale fully. The walls, sparse and functional, no longer felt like a mere refuge. They had become a symbol of the boundaries I had established and the life I was reconstructing. I checked my accounts. The funds that had been recovered, the ongoing restitution payments, and the security measures I had implemented over the past months all signaled that I was gradually regaining the stability that had been stripped away from me. In the following weeks, the practicalities of rebuilding continued. My professional life regained its rhythm, clients were understanding and supportive, and I could once again focus on my work without the omnipresent fear of financial manipulation. Therapy sessions became my anchor, helping me process not only the betrayal, but also the patterns in my family that had enabled it. I learned to recognize my own boundaries, to assert them without guilt, and to differentiate between obligations born of love and obligations imposed by manipulation. Birthdays, holidays, and other markers of family expectation were approached differently now. Instead of forcing myself into the painful theater of obligatory family gatherings, I celebrated selectively, surrounded by people who genuinely valued and supported me. Each choice reinforced my understanding that family is defined not by blood alone, but by respect, mutual support, and the honoring of personal boundaries. One of the more unexpected outcomes of this process was my evolving relationship with my father. Tentative conversations had deepened into regular video calls, and he even visited briefly, allowing us to connect as adults, acknowledging past absences and offering support without pressure or judgment. These interactions contrasted sharply with the manipulative dynamics I had endured with my mother and sister, illustrating what a respectful and accountable family connection could look like. Financially, I had recovered a significant portion of what had been taken, though the remainder would require time and diligence to reclaim fully through restitution. More importantly, I had restored my sense of agency. I was no longer defined by the demands and expectations of a family that had repeatedly exploited me. My boundaries were no longer negotiable, and my judgment about what was acceptable and safe had been tested and proven. Sitting on the balcony of my new apartment one evening, watching the city bathe in the warm glow of twilight, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The betrayal, the legal battles, and the fractured family ties had exacted a heavy toll, yet they had also catalyzed a transformation. I had discovered resilience I had not realized I possessed, learned to value my own needs alongside others, and begun constructing a life that prioritized respect, security, and self-worth. The courtroom verdict, though final in its legal implications, marked merely the end of one chapter. The ongoing work of healing, rebuilding trust in myself, and redefining what family and support meant continued. And yet, the freedom I felt, freedom from manipulation, fear, and the expectation that my resources and self could be exploited, was profound. For the first time, I was fully in control of my life, my boundaries respected, and my achievements recognized as my own. Justice had been served, boundaries enforced, and I had survived the crucible of betrayal. The empty space left by my mother's and sister's actions was real, yet within it lay the potential to cultivate a life defined not by others' demands, but by my own principles, strength, and autonomy. In that quiet moment, I understood. I was no longer merely a victim. I was the architect of my own security, dignity, and future. Time passed in a quiet, almost deliberate rhythm, allowing the sharp edges of the previous chaos to soften. I moved into a new apartment, one that felt entirely my own, where the walls did not echo with old accusations or whispered tensions. Every corner of the space seemed to promise a fresh start, and even the simplest tasks, making the bed, arranging the kitchen, felt like small victories in reclaiming autonomy. Financial recovery unfolded slowly but steadily. There were forms to fill, accounts to reopen, and bills that had to be confronted with a cautious optimism. Each completed step, though minor on its own, added up to a tangible sense of stability. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the constant knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. Therapy sessions with Dr. Linden became a steady anchor. She guided me gently through the labyrinth of my feelings, helping me untangle the ingrained patterns that had governed my family life. We explored the weight of being the responsible daughter, the role I had unconsciously assumed for decades. It was exhausting to confront how often I had suppressed my own needs, placing the comfort of others above my own. Yet in acknowledging these patterns, I discovered a fragile freedom. The sessions were never just talk. They were a space to experiment with new ways of being. I learned to voice discomfort without fear of reprisal, to set boundaries without guilt, and to accept that my worth did not hinge on the appeasement of others. There were moments of frustration, when memories surged or doubts crept in. But Dr. Linden's calm presence reminded me that healing is iterative, not linear. Evenings became a time for reflection rather than apprehension. I journaled my thoughts, noting small shifts in perception and the subtle expansion of my own patience with myself. Gradually, the apartment, once only a shelter from the past, became a home imbued with intentionality and quiet pride. Outside the therapy room, I navigated interactions with family cautiously, armed with the understanding that I no longer needed to shoulder responsibility for their mistakes. I could engage without being consumed, observe without becoming entangled, and acknowledge connections without sacrificing my own peace. This period of reconstruction was less about dramatic gestures and more about internal realignment. The freedom to define my own routines, to reclaim decision-making, and to honor my emotions without judgment felt revolutionary in its simplicity. Slowly, I sensed the emergence of a more centered self, one capable of acknowledging the past without being bound by it, of embracing personal worth without external validation. Dr. Linden's guidance illuminated recurring patterns I had normalized: the silent endurance, the compulsive caretaking, the constant calculation of others' reactions. Recognizing these tendencies was painful, yet it also offered a pathway to reshaping my identity. I began to experiment with new habits, prioritizing rest, pursuing small joys without apology, and confronting uncomfortable feelings directly rather than deflecting them. Financial independence, once a distant aspiration, became intertwined with emotional reclamation. Each payment processed, each account balanced, was a tangible assertion of control. The apartment, the therapy, the reestablishment of personal finances, together they formed a foundation upon which I could rebuild a life not dictated by fear or obligation, but guided by conscious choice. Over time, I noticed a subtle shift in how I perceived myself. The lens of responsibility no longer carried the weight of martyrdom. It was a tool to be wielded selectively and intentionally. I could care without overextending, give without erasing, and remain accountable to my own needs first. This reorientation was not instantaneous. It required patience, reflection, and often uncomfortable self-confrontation. But with each day, it solidified into a newfound equilibrium. Even as I embraced this autonomy, there remained traces of sorrow for the family ties that had been strained or broken. The ache was neither regret nor bitterness, but an acknowledgement of complexity, the coexistence of love, disappointment, and personal growth. I was learning that strength did not necessitate detachment from emotion, and that boundaries could coexist with compassion. By the time the weeks turned into months, the combination of therapy, personal space, and financial agency had created a rhythm that felt authentically mine. I could navigate the world with a renewed sense of stability, the awareness that my past had shaped me, but did not define me. Each morning offered the quiet triumph of waking into a life I was consciously choosing, and each night, a reflection of progress earned through resilience and intentionality. The apartment, once merely a refuge, now stood as a testament to recovery, a place where the echoes of past betrayals were gradually replaced by deliberate, self-directed growth. Dr. Linden's voice, always measured and steady, had become an internal compass, guiding me toward self-recognition and the acknowledgement of intrinsic worth. In this space of reflection and reconstruction, I discovered the essential truth of the period. Healing is a process of reclaiming agency, understanding one's patterns, and cultivating self-respect. The journey was far from over, but the foundation was solid, and for the first time in a long while, I felt fully capable of navigating life on my own terms. I hadn't expected it, the moment when paper and ink would carry more weight than months of silence. The letters arrived in the same mailbox that had felt so heavy with avoidance, denial, and anger. I held them in my hands, two envelopes marked with familiar handwriting, hesitant yet deliberate. My fingers trembled slightly, not with fear but with a cautious curiosity. I had rehearsed this in my mind countless times, imagining anger, resentment, even disgust. But what I felt was something entirely different. A fragile anticipation, like stepping onto thin ice. I opened my mother's letter first. The words were careful, measured, yet unmistakably sincere. She acknowledged the theft, her role in it, the lies that had piled up like stones between us. There was no attempt to justify or shift blame, no casual, dismissive phrases. Every sentence carried the weight of admission, each line a small tremor of accountability. I read slowly, almost reluctantly, letting each word settle in. I felt an odd mix of relief and wariness. Relief, because the truth was finally laid bare. Wariness, because honesty alone couldn't erase the years of betrayal. She expressed regret, not theatrically, but with a quiet gravity that surprised me. There was an understanding that her actions had fractured trust and caused long-lasting pain. Her sentences traced the contours of guilt, acknowledgement of my suffering, and a wish, tentative yet genuine, for some reconciliation. Yet even in this admission, I sensed boundaries she was unwilling to cross. She did not ask for forgiveness outright, nor did she demand it. The letter ended with a hope for understanding, leaving the space between us open, neither bridged nor burned, just suspended. Then I turned to Amanda's letter. Her handwriting was smaller, lighter, as if the words themselves were timid. She admitted wrongdoing and expressed regret, but her tone carried a lingering innocence, almost naivety. It wasn't that she was insincere, only that her understanding of consequence was still developing. She spoke of remorse and sorrow, but also of confusion, as if navigating guilt for the first time. I could sense the spark of self-reflection, fragile and uncertain, yet undeniably present. Unlike my mother's letter, Amanda's lacked the heavy gravity, but it had something softer, tender in its awkward honesty. Reading her words, I realized that recognition of wrongdoing comes in different shades, each shaped by age, personality, and experience. My emotions shifted subtly as I moved from one letter to the next. I felt the boundaries of my heart being tested, the instinct to close off, to hold tight to my hurt, against the faint pull of empathy and cautious forgiveness. I did not reach for a response immediately. These letters were not a call for immediate reconciliation. They were acts of acknowledgement, gestures of reflection that required observation, absorption, and careful deliberation. I placed the letters side by side, reading snippets again, noticing nuances I had missed before. The silence of the room amplified the weight of the words. The letters were acts of vulnerability, confessions without defense, yet they did not erase the past. They were not absolution, they were recognition. The act of writing them, of sitting down and confronting the truth, even imperfectly, was a step neither my mother nor Amanda could have taken lightly. And in that step, I glimpsed a possibility of rebuilding, cautious and measured. For the first time, I felt a subtle shift within myself. The anger I had carried, the sense of betrayal and loss, did not disappear, but it was tempered by the recognition that acknowledgement, however small or flawed, could exist alongside hurt. My gaze lingered on the paper, tracing the lines, feeling the texture, sensing the weight of words chosen and words withheld. I understood that the letters were not a bridge yet, not a surrender of boundaries, but a marker of potential. A way forward if carefully navigated. I did not respond immediately. I set the letters aside, letting them rest on the table as I moved about the apartment. Their presence lingered, quiet but insistent, a reminder of past wounds and current possibilities. I could feel the tension in my chest ease slightly, as if the act of reading and acknowledging had already begun a slow, internal healing. The letters demanded reflection, not reaction, patience, not impulse. and I honored that. Over the following days, I revisited them multiple times. Each reading revealed different layers, subtle shifts in understanding. I began to grasp the depth of human complexity, the different ways guilt and remorse manifest, and the delicate art of setting boundaries while allowing for cautious connection. I recognized that this process, this interplay of acknowledgement, reflection, and restrained response, was as vital as any legal proceeding, any external judgment. It was an internal reckoning, one that required time and introspection. The letters symbolized acts of cleansing, not of absolution. They carried weight and they carried truth, but they were not keys to unlocking full reconciliation. That, I knew, would come only with careful observation of actions over time. Still, for the first time, I sensed a flicker of possibility, a subtle opening where once there had been only walls. I realized that forgiveness, if it were ever to come, would not be immediate or unconditional. It would be cautious, deliberate, and rooted in the recognition of honesty and accountability. I held the letters once more, reading the final lines aloud to myself. The words were simple, yet potent: acknowledgement without demand, remorse without expectation. They carried both weight and lightness, a paradox I could feel in the pit of my stomach and the lift of my chest simultaneously. I placed them carefully in a folder, a tangible reminder of the first steps toward understanding, a record of reflection that was both painful and necessary. In that quiet moment, I realized that the journey of trust and forgiveness would be long and cautious. The letters were not an ending, nor were they a beginning. They were markers, signposts along a road of careful reconstruction, a map of where I had been and where, cautiously, I might go. And I felt, for the first time in a long while, that I could navigate that road with both awareness and guarded hope. A year had passed since the storm that had upended my life. Time, though not a healer in itself, had offered perspective, a space in which I could reconstruct the fragments of myself. My apartment, small but suffused with sunlight, felt like a sanctuary I had earned through vigilance, patience, and deliberate choice. Every corner carried a subtle testament to regained control. The orderly bookshelves, the carefully arranged kitchen, the modest desk where letters and documents could be reviewed without fear or intrusion. Financial recovery, though painstaking, was no longer a source of anxiety. The accounts I had once hidden under layers of passwords and fear were now stable, transparent, and my own. I could breathe without checking balances every few minutes, could make plans without hesitating over the possibility of betrayal. This security was not merely numerical. It was symbolic, a boundary erected between what had been stolen from me and what I had reclaimed for myself. Emotionally, the scars remained, faint but discernible. The letters from my mother and sister were stored safely, a reminder of missteps and remorse, yet also of limits. I read them sometimes, tracing the lines with a mixture of empathy and cautious detachment. Forgiveness, I realized, was not a surrender of memory or principle, but a deliberate acknowledgement that the past could not be rewritten. Their words no longer held power over my peace. They existed as echoes of lessons learned, of boundaries asserted, and of resilience discovered. I had also rebuilt my circle of trust. Friends who had been peripheral now became anchors. Relationships were chosen, nurtured, and evaluated with clarity I had previously lacked. These connections were not a replacement for family, but a complement, a proof that support and loyalty could exist outside the home I had outgrown. I had learned to measure intimacy not by bloodline, but by consistency, respect, and shared values. The bond with my father had shifted, quietly but profoundly. His occasional calls and patient listening were no longer tinged with expectation or guilt. We had found a rhythm in which acknowledgement of the past existed alongside an openness to the present. His support became a mirror of the respect I demanded for myself, a reflection of the boundaries I had set and maintained. And yet, amidst the practical and emotional reconstructions, the philosophical reflections lingered, demanding contemplation. I often sat by the window in the late afternoon, letting the light fall across my hands as I considered the architecture of family, the currency of trust, and the price of self-respect. There was clarity now. Love, even when genuine, was insufficient when not paired with accountability. Loyalty, even when expected, was meaningless if it violated the boundaries of another. Life had shown me that some connections could only exist in shadow, remembered but distanced, acknowledged but carefully limited. I addressed these thoughts, silently, to anyone who might listen or read, as if the years of experience could serve as a cautionary tale. Respect yourself enough to enforce boundaries, I would think. Value relationships by their reciprocity, not by obligation alone. Understand the cost of trust and the weight of forgiveness, and recognize that family, however defined, does not absolve harm nor excuse neglect. My words were both a declaration and a meditation, a bridge between past hurt and present wisdom. The light outside shifted to gold, and I realized that the life I had reclaimed was not defined solely by what I had endured, but by what I had chosen in its aftermath. Each day, each decision, each act of self-preservation and thoughtful engagement was an affirmation of agency. I was no longer the daughter burdened by others' failures. I was the architect of my own existence. The year had not erased pain, nor had it dissolved disappointment, but it had instilled perspective, reinforced strength, and cultivated understanding. I knew now that freedom was not merely absence from violation. It was the deliberate cultivation of one's boundaries, the conscious embrace of respect, and the measured acceptance of what could be restored and what could not. And as evening fell, with the city lights flickering through the blinds, I understood that my story, though shaped by betrayal, was ultimately a testament to resilience. There was a quiet power in the knowledge that I had survived, that I had reclaimed my life, and that my voice, my reflections, my decisions, my principles, was mine alone. The past could no longer dictate my steps, and the future, though uncertain, was fully within my command. In the end, I learned that the measure of family, love, and loyalty was not in what was given automatically, but in what could be sustained with honesty, respect, and conscious choice. And I, at last, was free to define the terms on which I would live, love, and endure.